Hello and welcome back to another painting tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how to paint one of Mantic Games' Dwarf Ironwatch Rifleman. So instead of painting the miniature in Mantic Studio colour scheme, I'll be painting the miniature in this blue and silver scheme, and I'll be using the Army Painter's range of paints to do so. So here we have the Dwarf Ironwatch Rifleman. Now I've primed it using the Army Painter's Uniform Grey Spray Primer, and the reason why I've gone for this colour is because most of the kind of colours that we're using in this tutorial are quite mid-tone colours, so using a grey is an excellent way that we can build up colours and also have some nice shading going on at the same time. Now the first colour that we'll be using is to paint the tabard on the front and also the cloak on the back there, and we'll be using this, for this we'll be using a deep blue. So for this layer I'm using my medium brush, and I've just mixed a slight amount of water with the deep blue to kind of improve the coverage. Now what I might need to do for this is to do a couple of thin layers as opposed to one thick layer, and this will give me a really nice coverage over the area. So once we've got a nice and even coverage on the blue areas, we can actually start with a wash. Now for this we'll be using the blue tone ink wash, and we'll be washing this over both the cloak and also the tabard on the front there as well. So I'm going to be using the medium brush once again, just so I've got some better control over where the ink goes. And I'm going to be washing over the whole areas, and this will give me some nice definition. And I can be quite liberal with this. I don't have to be too precise as to where I'm painting it. However, I would recommend you mixing a slight amount of water with the ink, as it's kind of a little bit too thick as it stands to give a nice wash. And you can see here I'm just washing this over the entirety of the blue areas, and you can see it there pooling into the recesses. So now that we've slightly darkened the colour of the robes, the next step is to perform some highlighting and bring the colour back up. And for this we'll be using a mixture of crystal blue and also deep blue, and we'll be mixing these in around about 50-50 mix ratio. So once again I'm using my medium brush, and I've mixed a small amount of water with the crystal blue deep blue mix, and what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be gently running this along the ridges, leaving the darker blue visible in the recesses, such as like so. And by mixing in a small amount of water, we get a nice and more even coverage, and we can do a couple of coats of this like we did with the initial base layer, and this will give us a much better finish overall. So we'll be continuing with the highlights, and we're going to be using just pure crystal blue now, and we'll be using this to highlight the very upper ridges of the folds in the cloak and also the tabard on the front as well. So for this step I'll be using a detail brush as opposed to the medium brush from before, because I want to have a little bit more control over the paint at this stage. Now I've mixed a small amount of water with my crystal blue just so I've got a better flow of paint, and I'm going to be concentrating this onto the upper edges, kind of the upper sections of the cloak and also the tabard at the front. I'm going to be gently running the brush down the edges here, just focusing on these upper sections like so. And also on this section here, and then there as well. So I'll be doing this across the cloak and also on the tabard on the front as well. The next step is entirely optional, but what we're going to be doing is applying a small amount of dirt and weathering to the cloak, and for this we'll be using Monster Brown. So for the weathering on the cloak, I'll be using my flat brush here. Now I'm going to be applying a small amount of Monster Brown to my brush, and then drying a lot of the excess off, so I've only got a small amount of paint, flipping the miniature upside down like so, and then just using a downward action. So I've got hardly any paint on here. You can see this creates this almost dusty effect on the edge of the cloak. I'm just going to build it up where I've already applied it there. And you can see that the finished effect leaves us with a cloak that looks like it's been through the dirt and the dust at the same time. So you can also apply this technique to the tabard at the front of the miniature as well. So now that we've finished painting the cloak, we can move on to the leather areas, and this will include the gloves, the boots, and also the pouch on the side there as well. And we'll be painting these with matte black. So for painting the black areas, I'm back to using my medium brush, and I'm going to be applying this over the areas such as the gloves and the boots and also the pouch as well, in much the same way I applied the base layer for the robe, the cloak at the back as well. So I've watered it down slightly. I'm going to be using a few thin coats, and this will give me a nice and even coverage. So after painting the black onto the leather areas, the next step is to start with some highlights. And for this we'll be using Uniform Grey, and we'll be applying this to the edges of the black areas that we've just painted. So as with the highlights before, I've got my detail brush here, and I've got a small amount of water on there as well, just to make it easy to do the highlight. And I'm just going to be running this brush along the edges of the black areas on the gloves and such like that. And we don't have to make it too thin at this stage, so we'll be doing a secondary highlight afterwards. So the final highlight for the leather areas is to apply another highlight, which will be of ash grey this time. So for this highlight of ash grey, we're focusing mainly on the upper areas, and I'm using the small detail brush again. So I'm just going to paint a small amount on this top section around the cuff here. Just painting over where I've already painted, and just along the top sections of these folds as well. And this will simulate the light hitting the leather from above. The next step is to paint the cloth on the arms here and also there as well. And we'll be painting these with leather brown. So the brown here should cover quite nicely over the grey. However, I would recommend still watering it down slightly and applying a few thinner coats as opposed to one thick one, and this will give you the best coverage possible. So once the base layer is dry, we can now start on a wash on the arms, and for this we'll be using a strong tone ink. So I've mixed a small amount of water into my strong tone ink wash, and I'm using my medium brush, but I'm still going to make sure that I don't overspill into any other areas, and I'm just going to apply this over the brown areas, and this will create some nice shading in the recesses like so. So next we'll be highlighting over the areas that we've just painted on these sleeves there, and for this we'll be using Monster Brown. So I'll now be using my small detail brush just to highlight some of the ridges on the just on the inside of the elbows here, as you can just see there. So I'll just be running my brush along those ridges there and just creating this highlight. And I'll be doing the same on the other side as well, whilst there isn't quite as many ridges as there is on the right arm. I can still apply a highlight just on this top section like so. So the next step is to now work on the weapon stock and also the beard of the dwarf as well. Now you can paint the beard any colour you want really, you can paint it to reflect ginger or grey, but I'll be using brown for the sake of this tutorial, and for this I'll be using oak brown. So I'll be using my small detail brush for this step because I don't want to overspill onto the other areas that I've painted. So I've applied a small amount of water onto the painters here, just give me an even flow. And I'll be painting a couple of layers, just give me a nice and even coverage like I did with the previous steps. So now that the base layer is complete, we can now apply some shading. And for this we'll be using strong tone ink and be washing this over the areas that we've just painted. So as in the previous step, I'm using my small detail brush here. And this is mainly so I don't overspill into the other areas. And I'm just going to be applying this over the brown areas I've just painted, making sure that it gets into all the recesses and creates some nice shading. So I'll now be highlighting the beard and the weapon stock using Monster Brown. So for this step I'll be using my detail brush here, and I'll be painting the strands on the beard. Now this is quite a good example, this particular head here, because the strands are quite well defined. So I'm just going to be lightly dragging my brush along the strands there, focusing mainly on the bottom sections there, and this will create some nice shading effect across the beard. So the final non-metallic step in this tutorial is to paint the skin on the dwarf's face, and for this we'll be starting off with tanned flesh. So for this step I'm using my smaller detail brush. Now I want to be very careful here not to overspill onto the beard. It doesn't be too much if you spill into the helmet at this stage, as we'll be painting over that next. So I'm just going to be painting the nose first, just painting like that, and as we've done in all the base layers so far, I've applied a small amount of water into the mix of the paint, and I'm going to apply 2 layers to get a really nice and even coverage. So now that the base layer is down, it's now time to apply a wash, and we'll be using a flesh wash for this. So for this step I'm using my detail brush. I'm just going to be applying this onto the skin there, making sure that I don't overspill onto the beard. It's not too bad at this stage if you go onto the helmet, as we'll be painting over that next, and this will create some nice shading on the skin there. So for the final step for painting the skin we'll be using a highlight, and for this we'll be using barbarian flesh. So I'll be using my small detail brush for the highlight of the flesh, and I just want to paint the exposed areas, so I want to keep it quite dark in the recesses still with the flesh wash, and also the barbarian flesh in there as well, sorry, the tan flesh. And I'm just going to apply around the nose here, and also the cheeks as well, just a small amount there. So now we'll be painting the metallic areas, and there's quite a few on this miniature. So this includes the helmet, across the shoulders there, the belt buckle, and also the knee guards as well, and also the areas on the weapon. And we're painting these with gunmetal. So we're back to painting on a base layer, so I've got my medium brush here. I'm just going to be applying this across all of the areas that are remaining grey, as I mentioned before. Then these are all the areas that we painted metal. So I will be doing some gold areas as well, so it doesn't really matter too much if you overspill at this stage, as we can just paint over them later on. So now that we've got the base colour down, we can now start to wash over the armour, and for this we'll be using dark tone ink. So for this wash, I'll be using my medium detail brush, and I'll be washing the dark tone quite liberally across all of the silver areas, making sure I don't overspill into any of the areas that have been painted in previous steps. So next we'll be highlighting the silver areas of the armour, and we'll be using plate mail metal for this. So plate mail metal is slightly brighter than the gunmetal that we've used previously, so this will act as a really nice way to kind of make the edges of the armour stand out. So I'll just be using my small detail brush here and running it along the edges of the silver areas that we've just painted, such as along this top edge here on the helmet. And I'll just be replicating this technique across the entirety of the miniature wherever there is silver. So now it's time to work on the metal detailings. Now this includes the trim around the helmet there, the detailing on the belt buckle, and also sections on the dagger at the side there, and you can also paint one of the panels at the back here on the armour. And we're painting all of these with weapon bronze. So as all of these areas are details, I'll unsurprisingly be using my smaller detail brush, and I'll be applying the weapon bronze very carefully, because I don't want to kind of overspill. We're the kind of final stages of the tutorial now, so I don't want to overspill onto the other areas. So I'm just going to paint the trim on the front of the helmet here. Be very careful not to paint over the skin there. I'm just going to repeat this technique across the entirety of the miniature, making sure not to overspill where I've already painted. So now it's time to add a little bit of shading to the bronze areas, and for this we'll be using strong tone ink. So as in my previous washes, I'm just going to be applying the ink quite liberally over the areas that we've already painted in the last step, and making sure not to spill over into the areas that we've already painted. And I'm using the small detail brush for this step. So the final step, which is optional, is to apply some scratches and damage to the metal areas of the armour, and I'll be using shining silver for this. So for this step I'm using my small detail brush, and what I'll be doing is I'll be using this to simulate scratches on the armour. So I'll be going perpendicular along the edges and these short, sharp movements which will create these effects of scratches and scuffs on the armour, and I can just do a few more on the shoulder as well there. And this just represents wear and tear on the armour that's obviously been occurring over the course of many battles. So here we have the completed Dwarf Ironwatch. Now the techniques that I've used in this video can be quite easily applied to the other dwarf units, such as shield breakers and ironclad as well. Simply follow the same steps that we used to paint the rifle, to paint the axes and the hammers as well. So if you enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see me paint more Kings of War miniatures, let me know in the comments below, along with which armies you would like me to cover. Additionally, if you enjoy my series of tutorials, you can actually support me on Patreon, which will allow me to create tutorials more often and also cover different ranges as well. And I'll pop a link in the description below to my Patreon page as well. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.